Good morning. Good morning, KernelCon hackers. Welcome to KernelCon Science. It's been 5 years of KernelCon. So how many of you, make some noise if you've been here since the beginning? Yeah. Thank you. And if you just hopped on this corn train, you out there? Yeah. Okay, great. We appreciate all of you. So thank you. Yeah, I am Dan. Thank you. We have a really great program today. We have so many fun activities and events. And I just want to put a couple things out there first for the folks who made it happen. So I do want to thank our sponsors. Many of them have also been here for 5 years, and some are newer, but they all are really appreciated. It's hard to find sponsors that truly want to do this for building security community, and each of them do that for us. So we appreciate them. Thank you, sponsors. And then I wanted to call out our speakers, instructors, crew, villagers, and organizers. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And it's just a lot of time and a lot of effort. And each and every one of you put in so much to make it happen. So thank you. All right. So now I just have a few logistics to go through. I'm going to do that. They're all in your program, so read the fucking manual. But if not, you can listen to me here. First thing is code of conduct. We want KernelCon to be a welcoming place, and we want you to feel safe the entire time you're here. If you ever feel unsafe, I want you to find somebody in our security team. So like Jason in the back there, a red shirt. On the back, it says KernelCon Security. They're your first line of contact there. After that, organizers. Organizers have green badges. They might have a lab coat that says organizer, and just find one of them, and they will help you out. You don't find one of us, go ahead and find a volunteer, blue KernelCon shirts. They will escalate to organizer or security. But basically, just be good to each other. That's what it comes down to. Badges this year, AM radios. Remember to wear your badge during the con. Otherwise, Jason, who will help you out, will also toss you across the street. There are transmitters around the con. They have things you may or may not want to hear. So put your battery in there, hook up your headphones, and see what's going on. The badges are different colors for speakers, villagers, volunteers, etc. So you can kind of go around and figure that out. What else do I got? Oh yeah, on the badges too. There are antenna wires, headphones, and clips, all random colors. So make some friends, find your favorite color, mix and match, that sort of thing. And you can learn more about badges at the Badge Hacking Village later today. Again, in your bags, you have lanyards. We've done this every year. You got yellow lanyards, and we have black lanyards. Black lanyards are basically your standard lanyard. If you wear the yellow, it means please don't take a photo of me. So we appreciate you would respect others when they wear that, and don't take photos of them or post them on social media if they have a yellow lanyard. The talks are in these rooms. They'll break apart into 2 tracks. And we do have a few breaks, including one right after the keynote here, that you can use those to kind of visit other areas of the con. A lot of other spots open up right after this. So lunch is on your own, and there's a lot of great restaurants nearby. So again, find your people, go out to lunch, make some friends. We have perpetual popcorn popping on either side of the conference. So if you get tired, a corn break can restore your energy. Tonight, again, after the program, we have dinner, drinks, comedians. It's a great Kernel Panic party, so stick around for that. All right. New this year, we have the science fair. So you want to head over in the breaks over to the science room and see these exhibits from our mad scientists that put together. It's looking really fun. It's a great little activity, and I hope you go there and get something out of that. And of course, villages, tools back with some fun new activities in their lockpicking village. We have badge hacking, hardware hacking, radio hacking, mental health hackers now this year with more corn, which might be my favorite thing of the con. So you can head over there and check it out. Wild West Hacking Fest was awesome, and they brought back their labs that were really popular last year. So they're in a different room if you were here last year, but Wild West Hacking Fest is over there with their labs. Black Hills brought in backdoors and breaches. They'll teach you how to play this game, and they will also go around and they're going to have a tournament tomorrow, and you can win some prizes. So that's pretty cool. In talking about prizes, at the KernelCon store out there, if you can guess how many corn kernels are in this, yes, you have a chance to win a cool gift basket of swag that is that Kate has put together out the store. The store is right outside, and there's a lot of fun new items she's got out there. And of course, Mamma Mia, capture the flag is gonna be so much fun. I'm not Chris Pratt. It's fun. So, all of those fun activities open right after the keynote. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim so you can introduce our keynote speaker.
All right.
Thank you. Have a corntastic day.
All right. Thanks, Dan. All right. Hey, KernelCon. I'm Tim, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's keynote. So every venue has a different process for picking keynotes, and for that matter, for picking talks and all kinds of other content. For us, we have a nomination and voting process among the organizers, and we tend to aim pretty high for our keynotes for a regional conference of our size. It's only been around for so many years and that sort of thing. And I think generally, I feel like we've been pretty fortunate in the keynote department over the years, and this year is no exception to that. We feel very lucky and privileged to have the keynotes that we have today and tomorrow. And I started chatting with Wendy over a year ago about trying to make something like this work, and I guess persistence paid off. The APT of KernelCon was able to get Wendy over here, and I think you'll find that it was well worth the wait. So today I have the privilege of introducing Wendy Nather. And, her resume is very impressive from her current role leading advisory CISO at Cisco and, to being a research director, CISO, an IT security leader, author, influencer, like the list goes on. But beyond that, it seems that everyone that actually knows Wendy is what we call around here just good people. And in the past few days, I've run into people that have stories about her taking a cold call and then flying an entire company's executive team out because the thing that they were trying to talk about was too nuanced to do over the phone and do over the computer. So it flew the whole team out, said, we're going to help you out. We're going to talk about this thing that's too complex to do over the phone, all the way to inspiring women to actually enter the hacking or the InfoSec or the cybersecurity field. So like all ends of the spectrum, just good people standing here with me. As Dan said, you can hopefully tell from the materials and everything around the con that the science of hacking is our theme this year. And Wendy's really embraced our theme. Specifically the intersection of that with data, I believe is the direction that she's going to go. So she's good people. She's not allergic to corn. She's never been hacked by Kevin Mitnick that we know of. And without further ado, give you Wendy.
So Tim said, what do you want me to say about you? And I said, just make some shit up. It doesn't matter. So you get to figure out which parts were made up there. This is my first KernelCon. I'm really excited to be here. Although I have to say that I have yet to see an actual VM Unix file around anywhere. So I'm kind of disappointed, but, I'm sure one will turn up. When audio first came to workstations, especially the Spark workstation, we used to scare the bejesus out of each other by catting VM Unix to dev audio, when it was really quiet and it would go and then make somebody jump. That was fun. So I have to ask, who did the video that we've been watching running here? Is that person here? This is awesome. I loved all of it, and I had to keep taking pictures of it. And I especially love the Mr. Wizard segment with the oobleck. So I have my own oobleck story. Back in the 80s, I used to hang out with some ARPANET hackers. Anybody know Hobbit? He wrote Netcat. We used to hang out, and we used to play with oobleck, except we didn't do it at home, where there would be possible damage. No, we did it at hotels. So we would go to conferences, and one time we filled a whole bathtub with oobleck, and then we broke the bathtub from hanging on the oobleck. We like unseated it somehow, and so we kind of tiptoed out of there and left the damage. I think it's past the statute of limitations for that, so that's good. Yeah, it's science. We're doing science here, and I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a long time, which is the chemistry of data, which is what I call it. Let me see. I'm going to turn this up. Here we go. Wow, technology. Talking about what has changed over the last 40 years or so, and why it's changed how we think about data. First of all, as you know, everything has been, is widely distributed. And now consumers and enterprises all have the same software. It used to be that if you you could just tell by the software you were using whether you were doing work or whether you're doing personal stuff. And now it's all the same. If you're logging into Google or whatever, you're checking your Gmail, it's not really clear whether you're going to be doing it on behalf of your employer or not. Sometimes it just comes down to which login name you're putting in the login field. Except for, if you have... Nobody does ERP at home for fun. If you have ERP software, raise your hand right now so that we can do an intervention. But, everything else is pretty much the same. So the big question is, how do we figure out what's business data and what isn't? Because it's all mixed up together now. So this is the way we tend to think about business data versus personal data, especially if you are in the unhappy situation of being on a security team and you're having to investigate somebody, trying to figure out whether they leaked something, whether they stole something, having to look at what you think that are their personal devices as opposed to what you issued them and everything. So, you can't do it anymore by when it was created, like what time, because we work around the clock. What format it's in doesn't matter anymore. It could be, office format. It could be just about anything. You can't tell whether it's business or personal data. Where it's located, again, devices are all shared. Things are in the cloud. Data's just spread all over everywhere. Where it's used and stored, again, which software is accessing it, what IP address it's associated with, or what MAC address or anything like that. Doesn't tell you anything anymore. How it was created. So how we understand data today is kind of based on the classification of it, whether it's public data, whether it's confidential data, strictly confidential data. When I worked for a Swiss bank, our definition of strictly confidential was somebody's going to jail. And, the bank might pay your fine, but they're not going to wear the orange jumpsuit for you. So that was kind of the bottom line. Location and ownership of the file, what does that say? It doesn't say much anymore. Format and the container, and by this I don't mean regular, software containers. I mean just what's holding it. Is it a database? Is it a save icon, meaning a floppy disk? Is it, on a USB drive? Doesn't matter anymore. So what we need to add now are things like time and context changes and also formulas. And that's what I want to bounce off you today, is the idea of formulas as a way of analyzing data and their security requirements. So the first one, having to do with time, is something that I call data events, where something changes, not the content of the data, but the context around the data changes so that the security requirements are now very different. If you take the really simple example of a press release, and let's say you're announcing some, great new, like you're acquiring a company called, Biscuit Company. And so you want to set up your DLP to look for any mentions of the word biscuit. You want to search social media. You want to make sure nobody, says the word biscuit anywhere. Anything that any of your data that has anything to do with the word biscuit is strictly confidential until it's not, until the business decision is made to make that press release, and then suddenly it's the opposite of confidential. You want everybody to see it. So you're flipping in the time it takes to make that decision from one to the other, but your security controls are not keeping up. How are you going to go back to your DLP and change everything and all that kind of stuff? So business events or other sorts of events, here are some examples. We talked about the press release, or M&A announcements are another one of those. Options expiration dates. If you've worked for a trading firm, you know that a lot of the financial data that goes up to an options expiration date is very critical, and the integrity has to be perfect and all this kind of stuff until the expiration, and then you don't care about it anymore. You can just toss it out. Or in health data, let's say all the information around a doctor has one classification until the doctor leaves the hospital, gets hit by a truck, and comes right back in as a patient. Then the same data, the same content, because of the context, suddenly has a different security requirement. Now, I want to point out that security requirements are not necessarily the same as privacy, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but for security purposes, of course, you're talking about CIA and non-repudiation, but it's not all about privacy. Another thing that happens in data events are things that are statistical thresholds. If you work with any regulated data where, let's say, for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, for FERPA, anything that can be used outside of directory information to identify an individual student has to be protected, has to be treated as confidential. And so the sample size, or at least it used to be, was 4. So if any sample size of data fell under a number of 4, it had to be treated as confidential, because among those 4 students, you probably could infer which student it was. Another thing is moving out of a sparsely populated zip code. Again, if the sample size within that zip code falls below 4, then you've got to treat all of those as confidential. If a student of a particular ethnicity fails a test, then suddenly, and you could use the fact that they failed that test plus the stored ethnicity of that student to identify them, then it becomes confidential. So again, here are some data events that have nothing to do with the content of the data, but suddenly drastically change its security requirements. If data is tainted in some way, that can also change it. Another thing that happens to change how we think about data is what I call focusing attention. And we see this all the time on social media, where in general, in aggregate, we don't care if, our data is hoovered up and, in this crowd of millions or hundreds of millions or whatever. But if somebody decides to single you out, then suddenly you're not that happy that all that data is out there and people can go out and find it and dig for it on purpose. So here's a Google Street View. And here, let me turn around so you can recognize who that person is. So you can actually see, if you pull out on Google Street View, you can see the name of my street and all that kind of stuff. And, that's fine. I went for years without noticing this. But if somebody decides to pay attention or to call attention to where I am and what I'm doing, man, look at those shorts. Oh, my God, the bike shorts. Don't do that. Then it's a different issue. And it can get really dangerous. So Dave Lewis, Gattaca, on my team, is really, really good at OSINT. So I will just send him a picture out of the window of my plane. And within 15 minutes, he will tell me not only what flight I'm on, where I am. He got really close. He got within 1 row to my seat number. So this is what somebody can do if they are sufficiently motivated. And that's the problem with all the data out there, is what we really need is some sort of of at least a social norm against singling people out, because that's where most of the bullying happens. Another instance from, almost 10 years ago now, from the Sandy Hook massacre. Somebody decided to take all the public information, the names and addresses of handgun permit owners in a particular area, and publish them. Now, this was public data. Anybody could have found this if they'd wanted to. But the act of them taking that information, gathering it, publishing it in the context of the Sandy Hook massacre, all that context is what suddenly made this really sensitive information and very upsetting. So, again, these are all the sort of events and actions with data that can change what you might choose to have as a security requirement for something. The right not to be singled out is what we should be talking about here. Now I want to talk about precursor data. If you work in law enforcement, you probably know about precursor evidence or collections, or especially precursor chemicals, where you have no business having these chemicals. They can't be used for anything else other than something destructive. So, that's when law enforcement takes an interest in what you have. If you go into a pharmacy and buy 10 boxes of Sudafed, either you've got a whole lot of kids who are really, really sick right now, or you're going to make meth. And so trying to figure out which one that is, what that context is, can go either one way or another, but there are some things you just have no business having. And I think that's what we should be doing with some kinds of data. Like if you are not a payment processor or a merchant or an issuer or an acquirer, there is no reason why you should have collections of credit card numbers. There's just no reason for it. So this sort of precursor data we might consider looking for, and especially with entities, and saying, why do you have this? What are you going to do with it? You have no good reason to be holding this data. So another thing to think about in the future. So I'm going to throw this out, and you can feel free to argue with me about it. In fact, I love a good knockdown, drag-out data argument. But I'm going to argue that in this case, the difference between security and privacy can be what or whom the data describes. If the data is describing a person, then it has to do with privacy. But if it has to do with describing a system in such a way that you could, that you could draw attention to it, that you could single it out, that you could examine it, that's security. So there are a lot of the same things. There's not too wide of a gap, is what I'm saying, between privacy and security in some cases. The security requirements are the same whether you're protecting a person or whether you're protecting a system or an application or, some other data. So, for example, how much source code would you need to view to be able to find a hitherto unknown vulnerability? I'm just asking. All of it? Would you have to see all of it? Would there be a minimum amount where you kind of start to feel, well, publishing this is probably not a good idea. Maybe some random person is, wants to access a source code. What are they looking for? What business do they have looking at it? Anything or publicly accessible. Well, your decision is whether it's publicly accessible or not. If there's the issue of proprietary data for sure, but just in general, just say you got, a whole bunch of source code. How much could anybody have access to before you start to get nervous about it from a security point of view? That's what I want to think about, because you kind of know, you kind of have a gut feel. You can kind of go, yeah, I'm starting to feel nervous about this. And maybe we need to be a little more formal and structured about it and be able to say why. Here's the formula that explains why we should not be publishing this amount of source code, or we should not be sharing this, or, there's this amount of stuff that should not be open source. More things to think about. And the other thing, I talked about singling things out. In InfoSec, there's totally an InfoSec spotlight. If you look at what vulnerabilities are being announced in what systems, Log4j was announced, 7, 8 years ago at Black Hat. And it wasn't until somebody drew attention to it that everybody ran over to that side of the stage and they started investigating it and they started writing exploits and they start playing with it and everything. There's always going to be the next vulnerability that everybody runs over and starts looking at as soon as the spotlight's on it. So that's another aspect of security. There are lots of things that are out there today that we don't care about too much because nobody's really called attention to them yet. Somebody might have found them, but they haven't called attention to them. And I was just at the Cyber 912 challenge that the Atlantic Council puts on in DC. And if you've never heard of it, it is a great, great challenge for college students, grads and undergrads, where they form teams and you give them a scenario and they have to read through this scenario and then pretend that they're briefing the National Security Council on what they should do about it. So it is a combination of cybersecurity and public policy and law, and this is who should react to it. This is what we should do within 72 hours, within a week. Here are the agencies that should be involved. Here's the agency that should take the lead. And so they have a couple of weeks to write a briefing paper, and then they have 10 minutes to brief the National Security Council. That's me. That's the judges. And then, after we pick the semifinals, then they get an inject, another update of the scenario, and they just have overnight to write their next briefing paper. They go in, they do their 10-minute presentation, say what to do now. Okay, well, that just happened, so we can't do this anymore, and so on. And then finally, for the finals, they have 10 minutes to read the next inject and prepare their verbal presentation to the NSC. And I look at these scenarios and go, I don't even know how I would address this. But some of them are really, really fun. For example, this year's scenario involved a vulnerability that was found that the NSA put through its vulnerability equities process and decided not to disclose it because the TTPs were too close to ones that they were already exploiting on a slightly different vulnerability. And they said, we need this, you can't reveal it. So there are questions like this, what happens if the NSA says, no, don't disclose this, we still need it. And you say, well, eventually somebody's going to find out, and if they do, how are we going to handle this from a policy perspective, that the NSA knew about it and sat on it? So these kind of debates are really, really cool, but part of it is worrying about the InfoSec spotlight and wondering when it's going to come and hit that particular thing that you're undecided what to do, you're trying to protect it, that sort of thing. So the social engineering aspect of vulnerability exploitation is really interesting to me. Finally, I want to talk about the principle of least use, which is pretty much anathema, especially in any development organization where you get a list of requirements from the business and then you go, well, let's just collect this other stuff in case they ask for it later because it's going to save us time. And so you end up collecting all the data, whether you need it or not. But what I've just been talking about makes the argument for not collecting what you don't need until you absolutely need it. But that's, I don't know. How successful do you think that is in today's thing? We used to have big data. We used to be all about the big data. Do you think that's getting any better? Is there anybody who's willing to say, yeah, let's not collect this right now because we don't need it yet? No, I mean, hoarding data is what we do. We love to do that. But the principle of least use is something that could help address this problem. And it is the difference between the data that's in active use and the just in case we need it data. Could we take the in case we need it data, move it offline or nearline? Or could we do something else with it that affords it a little bit more protection? Because if it's in use, obviously it's got to be accessible. But if we're not using it yet, does it need to be accessible? So when I've given this talk before and I've had people from different backgrounds in the audience. There are some people who know their formulas intuitively. They understand what needs to be done with their data, how it needs to be protected, how it can change. When I worked for the Texas Education Agency, we had a team of quants who would go through the data that we were required to give to external researchers. We were required by the legislature. And they would go through and sanitize it and check all the statistics, check for all the thresholds, make sure that you could not use it, strip out all the SSNs. We'd give it to the researcher, and then the researcher would go back to the school districts, get the SSNs, and re-weaponize the data. So, exactly. It's just, we're like, really? Can you not? But, it was out of our hands after we handed it off to the researchers. But we did at least what we thought was our part to protect the students. But there are ways in which you can know these formulas and maybe write them into your data sharing agreements with other parties, saying, here's what we're giving you. Here are the elements. You cannot do these number of things with this data. You cannot add this data to this data because, that will violate the terms that we originally gave you the data under. That's a really important thing that you should be talking with, with your business leaders about. What kinds of formulas are important with you? What could somebody do with the data? And how the time and events change it. And business decisions, how those change it. And hopefully you're already at the table, or somebody from your team is at the table in discussions, especially with legal, about, okay, we're going to do this new thing involving new data. It's not necessarily just about privacy, although that's a big portion. It can be also about the security of your infrastructure. What could somebody learn from these things that we're publishing? When you should be pruning the data. Now, there are record retention requirements, especially in the public sector, but there's no reason why you can't do this sort of thing. And it's not just email. I know legal always wants to, get rid of email because that's the most incriminating type of data that there is. But there are other things where you may be able to prune the data that you don't need. And so, again, in finance, in insurance, there are a lot of areas where people intuitively understand these formulas. They know that they're there, but they've never made them explicit. And they've certainly never put it in their agreements with third parties. So we should be thinking beyond the general leakage problem that we've had for so many years and start to think about abuse of data that we shared in good faith, or that we were required to share, or that we never thought about and somebody got a hold of it because we didn't think it was worth protecting until we found out what they could do with it. Those are the sorts of things that you should be putting, I don't know, if you have data scientists, put those in there, or just sit and think about it, because you'll find that once you start describing it, the business owners will understand what you mean. They just won't be sure what to do about it. The other big problem is for security vendors like us to figure out how to be able to adapt security controls to rapid changes in these sorts of contexts, because we know they can happen, we just can't react to them. If you think about all the different products that everybody has in an enterprise, all the different security ones, each one has a policy engine of some kind or a set of controls. So you've got massive policy engine sprawl. And by the way, Cisco's trying to do something about it, just saying. But for every one that you get, you're going to have to go through and say, okay, which products are responsible for this, which controls touch this data, how many different changes do we have to make? And that's untenable right now. We've got to be able to fix this. So I guess I'm just kind of laying out a problem for you. Sorry to start on a downer, but things are going to get better because there's popcorn. But now I would like to hear if anybody has more examples of these sorts of formulas for data that we should be thinking about and figuring out how to react to. Yeah, when employees are terminated, that's another business decision that immediately changes their data. Yes. Yeah, that's true. The example of having a tank, with a label that says sulfuric acid on it, and there's really no point trying to obscure that label or hide it somehow. Although, would you necessarily want everyone in the world to be able to find out that you have that tank of sulfuric acid? Is it just like, well, we can't keep it secret, but we're not just gonna put it out there either. Security through obscurity sometimes is a tool. It's not the only one you should be using, but, discretion is the better part of valor or something. Discretion is the better part of cybersecurity. I don't know, something like that. But yeah, that's a good point. What data is absolutely necessary for access, especially in healthcare? Anything that stands between the doctor and their ability to deliver care, you're going to protect it as far as you can until you suddenly can't. Because I heard a great quote from a doctor who said, "I do not want my patient dying on the gurney with his privacy intact." So, those of you who work in healthcare know that if anything is, authentication needs to fail open. It absolutely has to fail open. There's nothing you can do about that because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. In aviation, you cannot fail fast or move fast and break things when you're doing security in aviation. There are things like that. So, there's the balance between accessibility that has to do with safety and, which kind of data events require those. I have a friend who's a CISO at a large healthcare provider, and he had the discussion about ransomware with his board and said, okay, we're going to walk through this tabletop exercise. At which point do you want me to pay the ransom? And that made them sit up and go, okay, now this is real. Now we really have to make this decision. But the other thing he said is, let's say we have ransomware on this part of the network. Let's say it's, part of MRI machines. At what point can I cut off network traffic to that subnet to contain the ransomware? And so he had to have that discussion with them, that the unthinkable, deliberately cutting off access. And they actually let him do it. He talked through the scenario with them and said, do I have your permission to do this if we get hit by ransomware? And they signed off on it. So he actually can take that step if he feels it's necessary, but he had to talk about it ahead of time. But it is doable. You can do it. Anybody else have some ideas about data formulas? Nothing that where you put things together and it makes a cool volcano. Unfortunately, I haven't figured out how to do that with data. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a good question. What if the data is itself the formula? Yeah, that's a good question. Simply knowing the fact that these types of data elements combined are dangerous in some way. Gosh, I don't know how to deal with that one, except that I would probably treat it the same as any other intellectual property and just say, this is probably something that we best not talk about in public, along with the rest of our intellectual property. Don't get these elements of data from us because you could do this and that and the other thing with them. Or just add water, just add SSNs, and suddenly you have something completely different. So I'm going to be at the science fair, obviously, today. And if you have any other thoughts about this, I'm still evolving these ideas around the chemistry of data. I would love to hear about it. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a great conference, and I'll see you around. Thank you.